Maritime history is full of unexplained phenomenon and tall tales of sea monsters and, mariners going out and returning in different parts of the world and not knowing how they got there. You've abandoned ships. You have all these crazy things that happen out on the ocean. And many of them are just stories. We like to believe them because they're fascinating, but few of them actually hold up and are true. But one story, it is absolutely as fascinating as some of these very tall tales, but also happens to be true. Today, I'm going to cover that story, and it is the story of the lost Hawaiian fisherman. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have 5 highly experienced Hawaiian fishermen that take off on a daytime fishing trip. The weather turns really bad while they're out in the water and they don't return. Despite an extensive search effort, they are not located, and after a year, the families and friends of the lost fishermen, they host a memorial service and assume that their loved ones are gone forever. 9 years later, they make a discovery on a very small island 2,300 miles away that calls into question the entire story. It's an amazing story, it's a tragic story, but it's one worth listening to right to the very end. Before we get started, if you are into strange and mysterious stories like the one I've just described, my channel is going to be a bevy of content just like that. And so if you could gently liquidate... If you could gently liquidate... I can't even say it. If you could gently liquidate the like button... If you could gently liquidate the like button and subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. Scott Moorman was born in 1952 in the San Fernando Valley in California. At a young age, he loved the show Adventures in Paradise, which was about this crew of young sailors that would travel the South Pacific looking for adventure and passengers to pick up along the way. And it was just this brilliant show to him. And he became obsessed with living in the South Pacific when he got older. Specifically, he wanted to live in Hawaii. But that wouldn't necessarily happen right away because at a young age, he got married and had a son and stayed in California. But in 1975, he and his wife split up. And so he took that as an opportunity to go fulfill that childhood dream of living in Hawaii. And so he, on his own, his son stayed with his former wife. He, Scott, moves out to the east coast of Maui on Hawaii. And he moves into this little town called Nahiku. Now, Nahiku was full of lots of native Hawaiians and a growing population of kind of like refugees in a way, Vietnam veterans that were over living in the mainland. You have hippies and kind of earth-loving people that do a lot more partying than working. They were all kind of congregating in this same town. And Scott, he loved that culture and he quickly became a part of it. But he also, unlike a lot of the kind of hippies that made their way to Nahiku, that were part of that growing population, Scott really wanted to kind of become a part of the whole culture of Nahiku because he growing up, he loved Hawaii. He didn't want to be the others on the island. He wanted to be a part of the main culture. And so he took it upon himself to learn the sort of pidgin English that locals would use. He took time to learn some of the cultural traditions that they had and really went out of his way to try to befriend some of the locals. And while he wasn't really embraced as, a kind of local, he did form a number of friendships with local Hawaiians, and in time he really felt like this is where he belongs. This was home to him 100%. So he would only go back to California one time. He goes back once for his son's birthday, and he also sees his parents while he's there, and they are all pleading with him to come back, be with your family. They want him to stay. And he says, no, Nahiku is where I belong, and I can't envision myself living anywhere else. And so when he flies back after that one visit to California for his son's birthday, when he flies back to Nahiku, that will be the last time that his son, his former wife, and his parents, his family back in the mainland would see him. That's the last they would see him. On February 11th, 1979, Scott and 4 of his friends decide that they're not going to go to work that day. They all worked construction together. Instead, they're going to go fishing because they all love to fish and the weather was beautiful, so they said, why not? Now, none of them owned their own boat, so they had to ask a friend who had a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Their friend allowed them to use it, and so they got their boat, they went to the store, got some beer, snacks, and got some ice for their big ice chest so they could pack it with the fish they caught, that they hopefully caught, and they were on their way. The part of Hawaii that Scott and his friends lived in, the east coast of Maui, at the time did not get any TV stations, and radio broadcasts were done maybe once a week and were hard to pick up. So people in that area, especially fishermen and anybody that was out on the water, they were accustomed to going out without a weather report. They basically played the weather by their eye. They kind of just sized it up and said, does it seem okay? Okay, it seems good, and they would go out. Obviously that's pretty risky, but the locals were pretty good at it, and Scott and his buddies also were very good at this point at kind of reading the weather, and so they thought this day was going to be just fine. Now, in order to get to the place where they intended to fish, they would need to pass through something called the Alanui Haha Channel, which is considered to be one of the roughest and most dangerous areas for all sailors anywhere near Hawaii. So it's a dangerous place. It's at certain points, it is almost 7,000 feet deep. There's very strong surface currents. It's just a risky place to be if, for example, there was a big storm. Now, when Scott and the Sarah Joe crew took off, the water was calm, the weather was beautiful, and by about 10 a.m., when they believed they must have been in the channel at this point, the weather was still very calm. However, a low pressure system had picked up very suddenly between 10 and noon, and so when they probably were somewhere towards the end of the channel when they were going to be making their way into open water to fish, there was beginning to be torrential downpour all along the channel, and it eventually turned into a full-scale hurricane. So on the island, people described this particular storm as being one of the worst they've seen in 50 plus years. This is like a sudden, freak, horrible storm. Of the boats that took off to go fishing out of this East Coast section of Maui, there was 4 fishing boats that went out. 3 returned. The one that didn't was, of course, the Sarah Joe. At 5 p.m., the Coast Guard is notified by their friends and family that they have not returned yet. The storm is still raging, gale force winds, torrential downpour, but they still send out a plane to look overhead. A number of crews were sent out to go look for them, even with the incredible risk of searching in this weather. But considering the dangers they were in, they decided it was necessary. The searchers who were in the boats, the boat crews that were sent out to look for the Sarah Joe crew, they said that at best they could see maybe 50 feet in front of them, and even that was a stretch. So it was a limited search, but they did go out on the day of the storm. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard led a search that included 44 planes and boats covering a 56,000 square mile search block for the Sarah Joe, but nothing was found. There was absolutely no trace of them, and so after 5 days, unfortunately, the Coast Guard called off the search. However, the people in their hometown in Nahiku, they knew these 5 men. These were incredibly capable, very experienced fishermen. They were all great swimmers. They believed that because they hadn't found a trace of them, that perhaps they were still alive out there. And so they, as a community, raised $50,000 to pay private ships and planes to continue the search. So there was an extended search that went on for a couple more weeks that covered an even bigger swath of territory, but at the end still yielded no results. The people that were doing the searching were just baffled, because when people go missing at sea, there's some indication a lot of times when they're just fishing basically right off the coast, there's some indication of what happened to them. It's rare that you would have 0% found. Absolutely no idea what happened to these 5 fishermen. 1 year after their disappearance, the families and friends decide to host a memorial and mourn the loss officially for their loved ones. It was believed at this point that they had all perished. 2,300 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands lies this tiny little stretch of, I guess you can call them islands, called the Taongi Atoll. And these little tiny strips of land that were barely higher than sea level barely sustained any life. There was a couple scrub plants that took hold here and there, but there's no fresh water. The only recorded human life that's ever been there was during World War II. A number of Japanese soldiers were stranded there briefly, but it is 200 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It's very far from any major shipping lane. It's just a place that, as a human being, you don't want to go. In fact, it was actually considered, when they were testing the atomic bomb, when the United States was, it was considered to be a great spot to test the atomic bomb because no one's there and no one's anywhere near it. So incredibly isolated. On September 10th, 1988, marine biologist John Naughton, along with 4 other crew members, descended upon the Taongi Atoll. They were sent there by the Marshall Islands to find a suitable wildlife sanctuary for some sea turtles and seabirds. Within 30 minutes of arriving at the atoll, John and his crew saw what looked like a skeleton of a boat, a Boston whaler boat that was down on the shore. John was actually a resident of Maui, so he's from Hawaii, and he saw on the back of this kind of skeletal remains of this boat the letters HA, which means it's registered in Hawaii. And so he's intrigued because we're 2,300 miles from Hawaii, and he starts moving the sand away to get a better look to see if there's any more writing on the boat. And he makes out a couple of letters, an S, an R, an H, an O, an E, and he puts it together. He's like, this is the Sarah Joe. This is the boat that went missing 9 years earlier. And the reason he knew it that quickly is because he was one of the people deeply involved in the search efforts to find these lost fishermen. He was like leading search groups. He was totally committed to finding them. And here he is in a crazy twist of fate, 2,300 miles away, almost a decade later, finding the boat. Now, the boat did not initially provide any sort of information about where the fishermen might be. There was nothing on it. It was just the wood, very degraded from water, wear and tear. But the crew decided that they would search the island and just kind of look around, because perhaps the crew, even if it was years and years ago, maybe they landed here and then they ultimately perished once they were here. So maybe we can find their remains or just some sign that they might have been here. John walks about 100 yards away from the Sarah Joe, and he sees what looks like kind of a crudely constructed cross out of driftwood. And below it, he can see that there's a bunch of rocks that have been placed definitely in some sort of decorative way, and it looks like a gravesite. And considering what they're looking for, he thinks there's the first of the bodies that we're going to find. He calls over his crew, and so they begin kind of moving some things aside. They don't want to totally disturb the grave, just to be respectful. But a little ways down, the inside of the grave is not only bones, but they find this little book. The book had no writing in it, and it's hard to even call it a book. It was more like a stack of papers. But on each page, there was a little square cutout of tinfoil that sat on the page. Basically, every page had a little square of tinfoil and nothing else to it. No one knew what it meant, but undoubtedly, somebody had very clearly buried somebody else right here in a very shallow grave and had left this little book in here with whoever was buried here. And so while John and a couple of his crew are looking at this book and trying to make sense of it, one of his crew members that was just kind of standing back looking at the site commented that, the bones that are in that grave, they're not very bleached. Now, if a bone's been sitting for a long time, it will basically bleach and become totally white. Everything comes off the bone. These bones looked relatively fresh. So whoever was buried here, they had been buried recently. At this point, John and his crew have basically abandoned their kind of wildlife sanctuary research, and now they're just scouring this little scrub of land in the Taongi Atoll for any other signs of things that could have to do with the Sarah Joe crew, and they found nothing else. So they report back to the Coast Guard and alert the Marshallese authorities that what was found on the island, and they send out a couple of forensic experts to examine the bone. They were able to determine that the bones in the grave belonged to Scott Moorman. When news got back to the Hawaiian mainland that Scott Moorman had been found, the family members of the other 4 fishermen that went missing on the Sarah Joe, they hired private detectives to go scour the Taongi Atoll, look everywhere, see if you can find our loved ones' remains. And so this team of private detectives and a dive team and all these people are sent to the Taongi Atoll, and they look everywhere. They're digging up the sand. They have dive teams going out into the water. I mean, they are really leaving no stone unturned. And all they're able to find is the outboard motor of the Sarah Joe, which was a little ways off the coast from where the boat itself was found, wedged in some coral. And then they also found a handful of more bones on the beach near where that shallow grave where Scott Moorman was buried. But those bones also belong to Scott Moorman. So there was nothing else found of the other 4 fishermen or any indication of what happened to the boat. There's nothing. And in fact, researchers that were able to look at the bones of Scott Moorman, there wasn't enough evidence there to help them determine a cause of death. So we don't even know how he passed away or when he passed away. However, it was determined just based on the bleaching of the bones that it was a relatively recent death. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but recent is the term that's used. While it was a very big deal that they located Scott Moorman's remains on the Taongi Atoll, even though it was 10 years later, this is revelatory. This is a really big deal, not only for the families of the fishermen, but for anybody involved. This is a really big deal. But there was an additional revelation once Scott Moorman's bones were found that basically turned this case upside down. There's already a bunch of questions like, who buried Scott Moorman? How did Scott Moorman become freshly buried almost a decade later? You know, how long had they been there? There's some basic questions that you're going to ask. But there's one fact that nobody seems to be able to reconcile, and that was 6 years after they went missing, the Marshall Islands conducted a government survey of the Taongi Atoll, which would mean they scoured the islands, all those little strips of land that make up the Taongi Atoll. They scoured it, just taking measurements and basically mapping out the Taongi Atoll. I think it was in preparation for potentially turning it into this wildlife sanctuary. So they looked everywhere on the Taongi Atoll 6 years after the Sarah Joe went missing. So they go missing. 6 years later, there's this government survey of the Taongi Atoll. And guess what? They ended up looking at that survey, and there's no boat, there's no shallow grave, there's nothing. It's just an uninhabited strip of land, nothing else. There's no boats there. Experts, when this was revealed, said that, well, had they, the Sarah Joe, the crew of the Sarah Joe, gone dead in the water following the storm, they could have drifted the 2,300 miles to the Taongi Atoll in roughly 3 months. But they weren't there at the 6-year mark. So what were they doing between the disappearance and the 6-year mark, which would have been the earliest they could have arrived, because prior to they would have been discovered during this audit. So you have a 6-year gap where no one can account for where they were. Even if they made it to the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day after they had disappeared, that they had been somehow surviving in the open ocean for 6 years, and they just so happened to land at the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day later. Basically, just after the survey's done, let's say they make it there. Who buried Scott Moorman? And what was the booklet that was buried with him with the tinfoil squares? This is a totally uninhabited stretch of land. There is no one there to perform any sort of burial ritual. Even if we're willing to say that maybe one of the other fishermen buried Scott Moorman, well, then where are the other fishermen? Some people wonder, are they still alive? So like many of my videos, unfortunately, there isn't really a good conclusion here. It just kind of ends in a bunch of questions. But I would love it if you included in the comments section what you think could be the reason behind that 6-year gap. How can we account for those 6 years when they were not at the Taongi Atoll? I mean, my suggestion would be maybe the survey wasn't done very well and they just missed it. But that still doesn't also answer, well, who buried Scott Moorman? And also, why were his bones not so bleached? How did he come to be freshly buried 9.5 years after he disappeared? So lots of questions. I would love to hear your theories, your comments, your takeaways in the comments section. And again, if you liked this video, please hit like. please click subscribe, turn on all notifications, because I'm going to be posting stories like this one 3-4 times a week. I love doing this, and I hope you'll come along. If you want to follow me on other social media channels, my handle on Instagram is JohnBallen416, and I am MrBallen, one word, on every other social media platform. I post quite a bit on TikTok, so you can check me out over there. That's going to do it, guys. I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to reading your comments. See ya. I don't know about you, but I am far more interested in mysteries that have occurred in the relatively recent past. I think it's easier to relate to the people involved because they probably lived their lives kind of similar to how you're living now. Different, but similar, right? You know, and also like the information, if you're looking at a case that happened 50 years ago or less, it's easier to fact check that information, and there's probably more information about that case. Whereas if you're looking at something that's happened, let's say hundreds and hundreds of years ago, while certainly there are people involved in being a human being, I can relate to them in that sense, but the way they lived is a lot different than we live now. And so it's very difficult to kind of put myself in their perspective because my experience living on the earth is so much different. And of course, information, even if it was diligently transcribed at the time, it's taken hundreds of years to arrive in front of me now. And so the opportunity for information to change or to be passed down inaccurately or to just be a straight up embellishment is much higher. So the accuracy of information in older cases, it's a little bit up for grabs. So I tend to be interested in more recent mysteries. But there is one case, in fact, it is the oldest unsolved mystery in American history that I have been fascinated with ever since I heard about it in grade school. And the reason I'm talking about it now in this video is not only have I found it fascinating, but there has been some recent discoveries, as recent as 2011, that totally changed the theories about what could have happened in this particular case. And the case I'm referencing is the lost colony of Roanoke. The too long didn't read version of the story is when England first tried to colonize America, they set up a colony on Roanoke Island, which is right off the coast of North Carolina. And when it wasn't going very well and the early colonists, they needed more supplies, they sent their leader back to England to get more supplies. But when he came back, the colony was gone. All 115 people gone without a trace. And all that was left were two strange messages. One was on a tree and one was on a fence post right in where the colony used to be. And for centuries, historians and amateur sleuths alike have debated what those messages mean. But a recent discovery in 2011 completely changes people's interpretation of what happened at Roanoke. Before we get started, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, well, you've come to the right channel because that is literally all I'm going to be doing. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these cool stories. All right, let's dive in. By the late 1500s, England wanted to colonize America. And in the early 1580s, an Englishman by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh was basically given a permit to go colonize America. Basically it said, okay, it's 1580 and you have until 1591 to colonize somewhere in America. If you can't do it by then, you're going to lose your permit. He starts getting funding together. He starts, looking on a map to figure out where's a good spot to land. And by 1584, he's ready to launch his first reconnaissance mission to America. So in 1584, 2 ships make their way to North America and they land somewhere in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. They land and they actually quickly befriend the local Native Americans that are there. And in fact, they invite these English people to come to their village, which was on Roanoke Island, also in North Carolina, not too far from the Outer Banks. And so these early English settlers are brought to this village and they're able to coexist with the Native Americans really beautifully. They're sharing trade secrets, they're learning how to hunt, they're learning how to do all the things that you would need if you were going to live in this new land. And again, they're being embraced by the local population, which was huge. So after 1 month of this reconnaissance mission, that group of early settlers is really excited about the possibilities of settling in America. So they make their way back to England, and they share their findings with Sir Walter Raleigh, and preparations are immediately began to launch an actual colonization effort into Roanoke. So 1 year after this initial reconnaissance mission, Sir Walter Raleigh is ready to launch this full-fledged effort to colonize America. And so he sends 7 ships with 600 men and supplies that were designed to last that group of people for a full year. And so everything's going beautifully. They're sailing their way over to America. And when they reach the Outer Banks, their flagship, the biggest and best ship they had that was carrying the bulk of their supplies, their food, their fresh water, it ran aground, and a lot of their supplies fell into the ocean and were spoiled. And so this is a devastating blow, and they know immediately that, well, not everybody on this fleet can actually land here. So they sent 500 men back to England and only landed 100 of the original 600 in Roanoke. Now, as soon as this second round of settlers, these 100 men, landed in Roanoke, they went and spoke with the local Native Americans. There was already good relationships built from that first reconnaissance mission, and these settlers were given permission by the local natives to build their colony in Roanoke. So they begin constructing their colony, and everything is going off without a hitch. In fact, the Native Americans were incredibly generous. They worked closely with the settlers and did their best to support them however they could. Now, the settlers, they still needed more supplies. They didn't have this robust supply that they planned on having because much of it was destroyed in that shipwreck as they initially made their way in. So they had been promised by the 500 returning crew members that they were going to send supplies by the following winter. So they're anticipating this shipment of new supplies, and as they get closer to the wintertime, the 100 settlers that are there, they're running incredibly low on supplies to the point where they actually basically run out. And so they had to rely on the local Native Americans' generosity just to stay alive. When the shipment that was supposed to be there in the winter did not show up, and in fact had actually been canceled, they didn't know this, it had been canceled by Queen Elizabeth, who basically said that wasn't important, we're going to focus on things that are happening in England. When that doesn't show up, the tensions between these 100 settlers and the local natives, the tension was growing because now there's a huge overdependency. That tension grew to the point where the leader of the settlers and the leader of the local Native Americans began to not trust each other. And in fact, the local natives, instead of being violent, decided that they would just abandon Roanoke and go to the mainland and would just kind of give Roanoke Island to the settlers, and that would kind of solve all the problems. But the English settlers took their retreat as a sign that they were actually going to the mainland of North Carolina, these Native Americans, and were going to be forming alliances with other tribes, and then they were going to come back out and wipe out the 100 settlers. We don't know if that's true because what happens next is the English settlers, in kind of a fit of paranoia, they preemptively cross the water and they make it to the mainland and they attack the Native Americans that had previously been helping them and keeping them alive, and they actually wiped them out. These English settlers come back to Roanoke Island, and now the paranoia is even higher because now they don't have supplies, they don't know how to live there, they've just basically started a war, and it just so happens that an English-bound fleet was passing by the area on their way back to England, and when they stopped at the colony, the settlers were basically in a panic. I mean, at this point, they've just recently wiped out this Native American tribe. They're freaking out about what's going to happen to them. And they were in such a rush to abandon the colony and evacuate that only 97 of them got on the ships and left. They literally left 3 people there. They said, well, they're not here for the evacuation, so we're out of here. And so sure enough, that fleet took the 97 settlers and they left, leaving those 3 settlers to fend for themselves. As irony would have it, just days after this evacuation, Sir Walter Raleigh, he had sent additional ships with resupplies and reinforcements to Roanoke, and they literally arrived like a couple days after this mass evacuation, but when they arrived, the colony was abandoned and they didn't find those 3 men that were left there. So Sir Walter Raleigh's reinforcements just left. And then a couple weeks later, another English-bound fleet passed by Roanoke and stopped to check in on the colony, and they found it abandoned. And because they had so many people on this fleet that was passing by, they decided to leave 15 crew members at the colony because they felt like this is an English colony. It's not in total disrepair at this point, and perhaps this is going to be useful to the crown, or we can use it in some way. So they leave 15 crew members to basically guard the outpost while they go back to England and figure out what's going to happen next. So it would be months before anybody went back to Roanoke. So those 15 crew members were kind of hung out to dry a little bit. But a man by the name of John White, who had been a part of that initial failed colony in Roanoke, who had evacuated back to England, he was still eager to colonize America. And so he actually convinced Sir Walter Raleigh to launch a new expedition back to America to try to recolonize, not in Roanoke, but slightly north in the Chesapeake Bay, which was just viewed as a more fertile and just more advantageous position. And then in 1587, they send out 3 ships back to America to try this colonization effort all over again. It is important to note that unlike the first effort, which was much more kind of militaristic, it was literally 600 men that got sent to America. This time it was going to be a more kind of civilian approach, where it was men, women, and children being sent over to America to colonize. So with John White as the captain of these 3 ships, they're making their way towards America, and again, their plan was to go north to the Chesapeake Bay area, but they intended to pass by Roanoke on purpose because they knew about those 15 crew members that had been left there, almost a year prior. And so they intended to stop at Roanoke and basically have a meeting with those crew members, give them supplies if they needed it, and then make their way up to the Chesapeake Bay. However, something strange happens where the chief navigator, a man by the name of Simon Fernandez, who had navigated during the initial reconnaissance mission, the very first trip to America, also navigated for the second trip to America when they brought the 600 men, now navigating for this 3rd trip with John White. He had the charisma of a real leader and was frankly just very well respected. He's an incredible sailor. And even though John White was technically the captain, really it was Fernandez that really had the respect of all of the people on this trip to America. And so for some reason, Fernandez decided that he just didn't want them to go up to Chesapeake Bay. And instead, when they got to Roanoke to have this meeting with the 15 crew members, he just basically told everybody to get off. Like, we're not going to go north. Everybody that's here to colonize, go ahead and get off because we're out of here. And John White didn't put up a fight. I think he recognized that the pull this guy had was going to be too much. And the crew and everybody who was there just kind of accepted it. And so even though it was a total deviation, they just begin to colonize Roanoke, even though, again, that was never their plan. So as they're literally descending upon Roanoke, they're getting ready to meet with these 15 crew members who they're really hoping are still alive, but there's no sign of them. There's no sign of the crew that were left behind, and all they find is like a little pile of bones. And John White speculated that, perhaps this is a sign that the crew members were, attacked by, the Native Americans that were seeking revenge because they had been wiped out from that initial group that had been here, the initial English settlers. John White's suspicions would actually be proven true when just a few days after the 100+ group of colonists that kind of began setting up camp in Roanoke, a man by the name of George Howe was away from the colony a little bit, and a group of Native Americans surrounded him and shot him with 16 arrows. So it was kind of like a message to the settlers that, like, you're not welcome here. Your predecessors that wiped out an entire tribe, yeah, we haven't forgotten about that. So you're not allowed to be here. It was not a good start for John White and his new colony. Feeling like the colony was kind of doomed from the start, the colonists actually told John White, hey, if this is the way it's starting, we need more people here, we need more supplies, like this is not a good start. We are not set up for success here. You need to go back to England and get more supplies and bring them back here, because without that, we're doomed. And it just so happened that Fernandez, the guy that had kind of ditched them, he hadn't left the Outer Banks yet. He had anchored at the Outer Banks, and he was basically still available to take people back. And so John White initially was against the idea because he didn't want to be viewed as someone that was kind of abandoning the colony when he got back to England. And John White's daughter, who was pregnant, was there. She was one of the early colonists. She was there in Roanoke, and he didn't want to abandon her. But ultimately, he says, okay, I'll go. And he goes and gets on Fernandez's ship, and they go back to England. Now, unfortunately, when he got back to England, England was in the middle of a war with Spain. And so the Queen had ordered any English ship was basically not allowed to leave England because they needed to be able to defend themselves against the Spanish Armada. And so he wasn't able to leave England to go back to Roanoke, whether he had supplies or not, for 3 years. And so 3 years go by, and he finally, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, is able to be put on a convoy of ships that is going back to America with the necessary supplies. And so he heads off. So it's 1590, 3 years since John White has left Roanoke, left his daughter, and to go back for supplies. Now he's back, and he's got the supplies, and they get to the Outer Banks, and they get in their small boats to make their little journey up around to the north side of Roanoke so they can actually get on the island and go check out what's happening at Roanoke. And when they land on the north side of Roanoke, they start yelling to try to get anybody's attention. There's no answer. As they walk up into the woods, they notice that there are some fresh footprints right on the beach and then in the woods itself. But again, no one's coming to greet them, which is a bit of a bad omen, because if there are fresh tracks, either it's an English settler, in which case they would be eager to come see them, they'd be running out to meet them, or it's a Native American, which could mean they don't trust the English settlers, right? They don't want to show themselves, or they don't want to be seen, which is also kind of ominous. They start moving in to where the Roanoke colony was, and they see 3 letters on a tree. It just says CRO on a tree as they're making their way into the colony. And again, they're yelling the whole time, trying to get anybody's attention, and no one's calling out. There's no sign of life anywhere. So they see CRO on the tree, and then they keep moving closer, and now they break out the colony. And the colony, when they left, had not been heavily fortified. Now it was very heavily fortified with big pikes, basically like wooden pikes lining the outside of this basically looked like a fort. And on one of the wooden posts that was kind of fortifying the outside of Roanoke was the word Croatoan. There is not only nobody inside of this heavily fortified colony, this kind of fort, if you will, it looked like no one had been there in years. The grass was overgrown, basically anything of value had been looted effectively. The only things that were left were like really heavy objects that would have been difficult to move. But there was also no sign of a struggle. There was not like human remains anywhere. There wasn't a clear sign of struggle. I mean, obviously it's this well-fortified area, which leads you to believe that they were at least anticipating some sort of attack, but there was no sign of a struggle. They're just gone. John White, he would write about this experience when he arrived and just discovered the colonies vanished, 115 people just gone, right? He wasn't actually concerned, because the writing that he saw on the tree and on the wooden post to him meant something really specific. Before he left to go back to England to get the supplies, he had spoken with the people that would be staying there and said, look, if you need to abandon Roanoke for any reason, we need to have a system worked out to where if I come back and you're gone, I need to know what happened. And so you need to leave me a clue. You need to write a clue somewhere of where your destination is. If you're going by choice, just write the destination. If you're being forced, write the destination with a cross. And that will, to me, signify that you've left in distress. And so when he sees Croatoan and Crow on the tree, To him, that just means, oh, well, they must have relocated to the island of Croatoan, which was 50 miles to the south. He would detail in his notes that before he left Roanoke in 1587 to go get those supplies, he said that the settlers had been talking about leaving Roanoke, abandoning Roanoke, and moving 50 miles north to the mainland, not 50 miles south to an island. The concern was the island was isolated and not a good place to have a colony, and so they were talking about leaving it. And so he just kind of casually mentions in his notes, oh, well, they were thinking about leaving to go 50 miles to the mainland, so that might be why they're at Croatoan Island. But that doesn't really make any sense, because you're just kind of abandoning one problem set for another. Like, you want to leave an island because an island has unique problems. Why would you go to another island? You would go to the mainland. So that was kind of problematic. So John White believes they've just up and relocated to the Croatoan Island. And so he quickly takes his men and he goes back to the ship, and they begin to turn and set their course to go south the 50 miles to the Croatoan Island. But as fate would have it, the anchor line snapped as they're trying to make their way south to the Croatoan Island, and the weather was getting progressively worse and worse, and they start drifting north and north until finally the captain of the crew just said, look, we cannot go to the Croatoan Island. It's not going to be possible. And so they had to return to England. John White never would return to America, so he actually would end up dying with absolutely no idea what happened to the colony. And in fact, no one really knew what happened to the colony. It was just this huge cliffhanger. The assumption is they've gone to the Croatoan Island, but no one could prove that they really had. Literally, for centuries, people just speculated as to what could have happened to this colony. I mean, there's the assumption that perhaps they did just go to Croatoan and eventually kind of assimilated with the Native Americans there, and they just became a part of the culture there. There was other theories that they were wiped out at some point by angry Native Americans, but it was all just assumptions until the 1930s, when a small stone was found by a man just out walking around, and he turned it into a museum, and they looked at it, and it was written by Eleanor Dare, who was the daughter of John White, the pregnant daughter that he had abandoned and didn't get to see again. And she detailed what had happened. And half of the colony got wiped out by Native Americans that were angry at them, and then another percentage were taken captive, and then there's a couple survivors that are barely able to survive that don't really expect to live very long. At the time this stone was found, I mean, everybody knew that the last we had heard from the Roanoke colony was that they more than likely had made their way to the Croatoan Island, because that was the word written on the post, the CRO on the tree. I mean, that's what made the most sense. And so why would there be this stone by the daughter of John White 50 miles to the north of Roanoke? Wouldn't it make more sense to have been found on either Roanoke itself or at Croatoan? Like, it didn't really add up. And so a lot of people speculated that that stone had to have just been a fake, a hoax. But in 2011, a major discovery is made in the Roanoke case that actually lends a lot of credibility to the stone that Eleanor Dare had apparently written on. John White was a painter by trade, and he had created all these maps of the colony, of Virginia, of North Carolina, of everywhere he went. He basically painted a map. It was customary when you were making a map, if you had small mistakes on your map, you would actually cut a new piece of canvas, and you would put the corrections on that piece, and then you would slap it over wherever your mistakes were made. And so it wasn't uncommon, if you were looking at a map, to see little patches kind of all over the map. And so for literally centuries, there were these maps that John White had created that had a number of these little patches on the map. And in 2011, somebody who was researching said, well, why don't we look under the patches and just confirm that they really were just that, little mistakes that were covered up and corrected with a patch. And it turned out that on one of the maps, there was a patch over a section of land 50 miles to the north of Roanoke, around the area where that stone had been found. And underneath the patch was a star. And the star was set to resemble a fort. So basically there is an English fort built, basically where that stone had been found. but it had been covered over with a patch as if the fort was a mistake, right? Like, oh, whoops, shouldn't have been a fort there, and they put a patch over it. But upon closer inspection, the patch that had been put over that X on the map that signified a fort right where that stone had been found, well, on the patch, there was literally hidden ink where someone had drawn a similar X to denote a fort, and they'd put that over the obvious fort symbol that they were covering up. One could maybe make the case that they wanted to signify to someone that was maybe looking for invisible ink, they wanted to signify that that was where the fort was, but they didn't want someone who intercepted the map, for example, the Spanish, because they'd just been at war with the Spanish, they did not want them to know where a location of a fort was. Researchers began calling that site where there was that patch, Site X. Now, Site X is 50 miles to the north of Roanoke. And if you recall from what John White had put in his description when he was describing finding the writing on the tree and the post when he returned to Roanoke in 1590, he had referenced that the colony was planning to move 50 miles north to the mainland because that was a more suitable place to live. But of course, with the writing on the trees, everyone thought, oh, well, they end up going to Croatoan. Well, now as Site X, that is a location that lines up with what they had originally said they were going to do. And you have that stone written by Eleanor Dare at the same location. And so archaeologists descended upon the area that was Site X, and while they haven't confirmed that there's a fort or they haven't found a fort in the area, they have found metal and pottery that is potentially indicative of an English settlement. And in fact, right now, they're still doing all sorts of archaeological digs and research to try to determine if that is where the Roanoke colony went. But even if that is the answer to the mystery, that in fact, it was just this hidden map and this stone that said, yep, they went 50 miles north, it doesn't really answer the question, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of the Roanoke colony, of why was Croatoan written on the fence post? Why was Crow written on the tree? Why were they there? And how is it that with all these eyes and all this interest in this case, dating back to literally the 1500s, how has no one ever found even one of the remains of the 115 colonists that apparently just vanished into thin air? So it's a fascinating case with recent developments, which makes it even more fascinating. And I would love to hear if you have any theories about what could have happened to the colonists, to leave it in the comments so we can discuss it. So that's going to do it. If you want to be in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I post quite a bit on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, I'll talk to you guys soon. Something very strange seems to be going on inside of national parks in North America. Every year, hundreds of people go missing in these parks, but these parks are huge expanses of wilderness. So it's not particularly unusual that people might go missing inside of them. But every year, of those hundreds of people that go missing, there's always a few that go missing under very strange circumstances. Either the way in which they disappeared doesn't really add up. Someone will be watching or keeping an eye on someone, they'll turn around and then turn back and that person's missing and there's not a trace of them and they're never found again. Or you'll have instances of someone will go missing, there'll be an extensive search, there's no trace of them, and then they're found like miles and miles away in locations that are almost impossible to get to. Now, one man, David Paulides, who's a former police detective, he began researching these very strange disappearances inside of national parks. It started when a park ranger actually approached him and said, hey, there's a bunch of weird things happening in state parks. You should look into it because you're a former detective. And so after looking into it, he discovered that there were so many oddities around many of these strange disappearances. And he saw there was many overlaps and similarities that he really dove into it. And he's examined thousands of these strange cases. By his count, 10,000 plus hours of research. He's written 4 books. They're all under the name Missing 411. If you Google Missing 411, you'll find a plethora of information about these cases. He has 2 documentaries out. And so David, while he doesn't actually take a stance as to, what's causing these strange disappearances, anybody that follows along with the Missing 411 cases is basically led to believe that something is hunting humans in North America inside of national parks. It is fascinating, it is terrifying, and I've picked out 5 of the most bizarre cases that I've come across inside of Missing 411. Before we get into those 5 stories though, if this is the type of content that you're interested in, the strange, dark, and mysterious that I've kind of promised in this video, well, that's what my channel is all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your style and you like that type of content, if you could, please gently lambast the like button and then please turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the stories. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother, his father, and his grandfather headed up to the Smoky Mountains to go camping. This was a family tradition on Father's Day, and they were really excited about it. They get to the same campsite they always used. They set up, they have a wonderful first night, they camp out, and the next day, another camper in the area happened to walk by and saw that Dennis and his brother were playing there. And so this camper had kids as well, and he asked Dennis's father, hey, would it be okay if I brought my kids by? They're the same age as your sons, and they can just play together. Dennis's father says, sure, bring them down. And so the man goes, gets his kids, they come back, and before long, all the kids are playing hide and seek. Now, Dennis's father would say that he had an eye on Dennis the whole time. He was just at a distance, but watching his son to make sure he didn't get lost. And so at one point, all the kids are hiding from the parents. And, at some point, the parents say, okay, show yourselves. And all the kids, except for Dennis, show themselves. And Dennis's father has watched Dennis go behind a particular tree. He watched him do it. He was watching the whole time. And so when they said, come on out, and he didn't come out, he actually wasn't that concerned because he knew exactly where his son was. And then after a few moments, he yelled to his son directly and starts walking over and says, Dennis, come out, Dennis. I know you're behind the tree. And when he finally got over there, Dennis wasn't there. Dennis's father immediately starts running off into the woods, screaming for his son. And he actually ends up running almost 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, just hollering for his son, and he can't find him. And then the rest of the family had broken up and was searching the area because they're thinking like, he couldn't have gone very far. He was literally just here. And Dennis's father had said before, like, I watched him go behind the tree. I watched him. I don't know where he is, but I watched him go behind the tree. And so they're searching everywhere, and Dennis is gone. So a huge search, in fact, the biggest search in park history ensues with 1,500 searchers that included the Army Green Berets, so the special forces got involved. They are combing a 60 square mile plot. They're looking everywhere, and there is nothing. There's no trace. There's no scent. There is nothing connected to Dennis Martin anywhere. And so they go back to Dennis's father and they're like, you have to tell us what you saw. Again, this doesn't add up. If you were looking at the tree and he was right there, how is it that he has just vanished into thin air? But no one knew. That was it. No one knows what happened. There's no closure. He's just gone, and they never knew what happened to him. Years later, when David Paulides was doing his research for Missing 411 and was researching the Dennis Martin case, he interviewed other families that had been at the campground at the same time that Dennis had gone missing. And one of those families was the Key family. And they had asked a park ranger where they could go on the campground where they might be able to see some bears. And so the park ranger obviously said, be careful, but you can go over here to this section of the campground and you might see a bear. And so they head over there and they're looking for bears. And one of their children hears a scream or thinks he hears a scream and kind of directs the family to look in the direction of the scream. And from their vantage point, they could see up onto the side of this mountain where there was, call it sparse trees all over the mountain. So you could kind of see in between the trees. And they saw what looked like a bear running along the mountainside, but with something slung over its shoulder. Except the interesting thing about this bear was the father was quoted as saying that it didn't really act like a bear. It was acting more like a human the way it was running. It looked, hairy and like an animal, but it was running and dodging between trees. It was holding this, what looked like a child over its shoulder. It acted almost like a human. And so you have a bear man that has been spotted by the Key family, and they bring this up to the investigators that are looking into the Dennis Martin case, and obviously the Dennis Martin investigators, they don't take this seriously. They think that they're just, saying some ridiculous thing for attention or whatever it is. So, it never really was entered into the case with Dennis Martin. It wasn't until the missing 411 cases that it was ever connected. But there really was a family that claims to have seen a bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin had gone missing in the same area where Dennis Martin had gone missing. In the spring of 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his siblings outside of his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. And when the kids were all called in to have lunch, Keith was nowhere to be found. And so the siblings and the family went out and did a cursory search looking for Keith. And when nothing turns up, they call in authorities and a full-fledged search is launched for Keith. There's no sign, there's nothing. And 4 miles away from the ranch, they find several hours later some footprints that look like they might belong to a 2-year-old. And they start tracking those footprints and they go on for miles and miles, and then they just kind of stop. And it wouldn't be until the next day, 12 miles away from the ranch, that they would ultimately find Keith. Surprisingly, Keith, who had disappeared with not enough clothing to be out in sub-zero temperatures with snow on the ground and being 2 years old, he wasn't prepared for a night out. He was found alive, face down, 12 miles away. His jacket and his hat had been stacked neatly next to him, and he had scratch marks all over his face, but he was unhurt. When asked, what happened, he's 2 years old, he had said a cat scratched him, and he kept repeating that a cat had scratched him. That was the only thing that he could articulate. No one knew how a 2-year-old, in the span of 20 hours, could have moved in the middle of the night 12 miles away. Les Stroud, who's a very accomplished outdoorsman, he's the star, he is Survivor Man, he actually, because of this case, went out and tried to actually cover the distance in the allotted time. You have 20 hours to cover this 12 miles. And he couldn't do it. And he even said, it's not possible for a 2-year-old to have covered this distance, let alone survived the exposure to the elements in the time that he was out there. But somehow he did. And, years and years later, Keith was interviewed, because now he's a grown man, he was interviewed about what happened, and he has no idea. He has no memory of it. At the end of 1973, 19-year-old Charles McCullough, who was an amateur photographer, had been doing a West Coast tour of the United States, going to all the different national parks to photograph beautiful scenery. And by January of 1974, he was in Oregon and wanted to go to Crater Lake, where he wanted to take pictures of Crater Lake. So he asked his friend, who had an all-terrain vehicle, to take him out to Crater Lake, because his van, which was this VW beat up old van, it couldn't have made it out that far. And as his friend is driving him out to Crater Lake, Charles says to him, kind of jokingly, if you don't hear from me in a couple of days, file a missing person report. And sure enough, a couple days later, when Charles doesn't show up, that friend does file a missing person report, and an extensive search is conducted at Crater Lake to find Charles. There's no sign of Charles. There's nothing. There's no anything about Charles. And his father actually flew out there and stayed for several months, just constantly searching the area, found nothing. So nothing is found. So a year later, a couple of backpackers were hiking the area around Crater Lake, and they get lost. They take a wrong turn, and they're well off the trailhead, and they discover a backpack. In the backpack, they found a strange-looking Volkswagen key that anyone that knew Charles McCullough knew that he had this strange key. And so when they found it, it was a distinctive key. And so when they gave it to police, it turned out that it was Charles McCullough's backpack. So investigators went out and started looking in the area that this backpack was found, which was 12 miles off the trailhead. So this is well off the trailhead. And near the backpack, they find what remained of Charles McCullough. So they found his pants unbuttoned and on a log, as if he was sitting on the log and then just disappeared into the ground, but his pants were still there. Sticking out of the pants were his socks, no shoes, and in the socks were his feet bones. There was no jacket, there was no upper portion of his skeleton. 12 feet away, they find a portion of his skull, and that is the last thing they find of Charles McCullough. And ultimately, it was determined that he died of natural causes. His family was not prepared to accept that. However, when you look at some of the circumstances, we have, he's missing his jacket, he's missing his boots, he's missing his photography equipment, his head is detached from his body. He was also 12 miles off the trailhead. And when he went missing, there had been approximately 5 to 7 feet of snow that had dumped in the area. So how did he move 12 miles off the trailhead in 7 feet of snow, especially when you consider he was not an outdoorsy type. And even when he got dropped off by his friend that drove him out there, he even said later on that he felt like Charles was very ill-equipped for the environment he was going into. But at the end of the day, it was left as, sorry, he went missing and he died of natural causes, and that was that. Bart Schleyer was a famous outdoorsman and hunter. He was just one of those people that you could drop into any environment and he's not only going to survive, he's going to thrive. A testament to that would be he spent months in Siberia tracking and catching Siberian tigers. He was like a world-renowned tiger tracker. He's just like this super rugged, super competent outdoorsman. In September of 2004, Bart books a float plane to take him 175 miles north into the Yukon Territory in Canada for him to go hunt moose on his own for 3 weeks. He had all the right equipment, he was obviously extremely capable, and no one thought twice about it. When he got dropped off, he told the pilot, meet me back here in 3 weeks. And so off he went. The plane leaves and comes back 3 weeks later, and there's no Bart. Now, the pilot knew Bart was like a god in the wilderness, and so he wasn't really concerned, but, he went over to where he had been told his campsite would be, and he found the campsite, and it looked like someone was still living there. It didn't look like it had been destroyed at all. And then near his campsite, he found a dry bag, which looked like it had an indent on it where someone might have been sitting on it up against a tree. And then next to the tree was his bow and some arrows. And it looked like an area where a hunter might have been sitting to call in moose, but there was no Bart. Near the dry bag and the bow and arrow, they found Bart's teeth and a couple of shards of bone. Initially, the thought is, well, a large predator must have snuck up on Bart and eaten him. Except there's a couple of huge problems with that theory. One, Bart, his friends at least would say, and people that knew him would say, he would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness. Like, he was always a step ahead of everything around him. So the idea that he would just be sitting there one day and a bear would just happen to sneak up on him is pretty far-fetched. Also, in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. There's no marking on the ground or in the surrounding areas that a large predator had attacked him. Also, his camp had food out in the open, and if a large predator had come through like a bear, after it finished with Bart, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that, because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't really add up. In 2002, Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew that was working in Harris County, Georgia. And they were walking along this road spaced about 50 feet apart, all 4 of them. And Chris was the last one in line. And the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he would periodically turn around to just, for a quick second, make sure Chris was still there. And as they're walking along with no sound or any indication that anything's happened, he turned around, saw Chris, kept walking. A few minutes later, turned around, and Chris is gone. The third guy hails the other 2, and they go, and they're like, where did Chris go? They're looking down the road, like maybe he stopped, maybe he stepped off the trail, but they can't see him. And they go back they start walking down the road towards where he would have been, and they find on the ground a pile of loose change and some of his tools that would have been in his pockets. And then they see one of his boots stuck in the barbed wire, because there's a little barbed wire fence that was running the length of this road. One of his boots was stuck in the barbed wire, and there was nothing else. They search the area, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign of him. And it didn't make any sense to the people in this survey crew, especially the guy who was third in line, who was like I literally saw him a minute ago. And there's no way he could have gotten away without me hearing or seeing some indication of where he was. But there was no sign of him and he was gone. So after this huge investigation, they don't find any sign of him. And that's it. They're just like, yeah, he's gone. They did find 9 months later, they found his other boot near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity into what happened to him. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that at some point he may have been turned upside down. And if you think about the entirety of all of these strange stories where the idea being someone could be hunting humans, just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute where no one can see where they went. These 5 stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of others that are covered in the Missing 411 series. And while many people believe that all of the cases in Missing 411 and any others that ultimately are considered strange inside of these national parks have a rational explanation, even if we don't know what it is. Whereas another group believes that this Missing 411 phenomenon is an indication that something is hunting humans in the national parks across North America. Some say Bigfoot, some say aliens, some say something else. But paranormal is certainly the other camp in terms of trying to explain away what these strange disappearances are from or what's causing them. Whether or not we ever find a definitive conclusion remains to be seen, but I would love to hear what you think is going on inside of these strange cases of Missing 411, whether it's a rational explanation or maybe something paranormal or some other option. But I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And that's going to do it, guys. If you enjoyed this, please, if you could, gently lambast the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads every week. If you want to get in touch with me, please DM me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok, and my username is MrBallen over there as well. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, take care. One of the most terrifying movies I have ever seen has got to be The Exorcism of Emily Rose. What really made it scary was that it was based on a true story. The true story of Anneliese Michel, who was a 23-year-old girl living in Germany in the 70s, who was apparently possessed by demons. And there's a lot of audio recordings and some pretty incredible firsthand testimony of what happened to this poor girl. There's one scene in particular that, while it is a dramatization of what happened to Anneliese, it is certainly an accurate portrayal of what did ultimately physically happen to Anneliese Michel, and it is one of the most hair-raising, horrifying scenes in movie history, in my opinion. It is just downright disturbing. And so today, I'm going to be looking at the real story that movie is based on, which is, of course, the exorcism of Anneliese Michel. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, then you've come to the right channel, because that is literally all I do. And I upload 3, sometimes 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, if you could, please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Anneliese Michel was born in 1952 in Western Germany to a fiercely religious family. Devout Catholics who believed in some of the more extreme elements of the Catholic faith. Now, one of the things that they believed in and certainly pushed on to Anneliese and her siblings was this idea that sin could not be atoned on your own. It would require other people effectively sacrificing on your behalf for you to be absolved of your sin. And so Anneliese and her siblings would be instructed by her parents to, at times in the winter, sleep on the hardwood floor in order to repent for sinners that can't repent for their sins on their own. And so she'd be laying on the floor in the middle of the winter, thinking that what she was doing was saving other people from their own sin. In 1969, Anneliese would have her first seizure. She was at school, she suddenly started seizing up and convulsing, and her classmates would later tell investigators and her family that it was almost like she'd entered into a trance-like state while she was having this seizure. And then as soon as the seizure had ended and she was done convulsing, she snapped out of the trance-like state. It wasn't until a year later when Anneliese had another seizure in the middle of the night. She had this convulsion and her parents come in and she's in this trance-like state and she's wet the bed and then she snaps out of it and she doesn't know what happened. It wasn't until this second seizure that the family actually sought medical attention. They actually went to a neurologist. That neurologist would tell Anneliese and her family that what she was suffering from was something called temporal lobe epilepsy, where, amongst a litany of horrible side effects, a few of the more significant ones are serious auditory and visual hallucinations, a loss of awareness, and intense mental state. So Anneliese was prescribed medication by this neurologist to try to combat this temporal lobe epilepsy, but it didn't seem to do anything. And in fact, her seizures and convulsions and this trance-like state she would go into during the seizures, it only persisted and intensified. And it got to a point where Anneliese and her family believed the best thing for her to do would be to go to a psychiatric hospital where the staff there was better equipped to handle what was happening to her. And so she checks in willingly, and they start experimenting with different drugs, and nothing seems to work. And in fact, her condition only gets worse. She starts having more seizures and more convulsions, and she starts having a regular visual hallucination. Whether she's having a seizure or not, everywhere she looked, if she looked at anybody in the face, their face would become demonic. Like it would be a demon's face that would look at her and say, "You're going to rot in hell." And so she began not being able to look at people in the face, and she would tell the nurses and doctors, like with her head down, about these demon faces she was seeing. And it was the first time she began espousing this idea that she was in fact possessed by demons. In fact, 6 demons by her count. When she passed on that information to her family that she believed she was possessed, she and her family believed that the psychiatric hospital was not enough, and in fact modern medicine was really not enough to handle what was happening to her, that they would need to search for help outside of medicine, and so they turned to the Catholic Church. Initially, all the clergy that Anneliese and her family approached to try to help her with the situation rejected her request, and they said, "You need to seek medical attention. This is not something we can help you with." Not knowing where to turn, her family is kind of at a loss. At the same time, Anneliese's condition really nosedives. I mean, it was already pretty bad. It gets a lot worse. She began doing 400 plus squats every day, like compulsively doing squats. Then she began going under the table periodically and not coming out for 2 days, barking like a dog the entire time without sleeping. She began going to corners of the house and finding spiders and eating them off the ground. She would scurry over to the fireplace and pull coal out of the fireplace and eat the coal. I mean, she was really losing it. Finally, the family located a priest named Ernst Alt who believed she was possessed and that she was not epileptic, and he was willing to petition the local bishop to allow the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism. And so that bishop granted permission for a local priest, Arnold Renz, to perform an exorcism with the full endorsement of the Catholic Church. Over the next 10 months, Renz would conduct 67 exorcisms of Anneliese. And through these exorcisms, Anneliese would reveal that she was being possessed by 6 demons: Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Nero, Fleischmann, and Adolf Hitler. And so all of these voices, these demonic voices that were coming out of Anneliese, they were picked up on audio recording during the exorcisms. And in the movie, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, the most iconic scene in the movie is the demon scene, where they show off these voices coming out of, in the movie it's Emily Rose, but it's supposed to represent Anneliese Michel. And they do a fantastic job showing what that might have looked like during the exorcism. So take a look.
Give me a name! No! And I am Lucifer, the devil in the flesh.
And now I want you to take that scene you just watched of Emily Rose being possessed by these demons and think about that as you listen to the actual audio recordings of Anneliese Michel during one of her many exorcisms.
Ja, ich will auch für die anderen Leute, damit die nicht in die Hölle kommen und so. Aber dass das dann so schlimm ist und so grausam und so furchtbar, nee.
Gekletze! Nein, Gekletze! Von der Mauer mir Gekletze! Oh, so der Milane,
Als Kind Gottes.
Ich hab dein Maul erschlagen! Die Ruhe gibt's nur da oben.
Ruhe gibt's nur dort, wo die Liebe ist.
Ja, bei uns gibt's nur ja nun. Die müssen in eigenen Seminaren ausgebildet werden, die dürfen nicht auf die anderen Universitäten. Kapiert?
Geistes.
Nein,
Geboren ist hier auszufahren und nicht.
Initially, the exorcisms seemed to make things better for Anneliese. She got to a place where the seizures and convulsions and trance-like states and odd behavior were so few and far between that she actually re-enrolled in university and was even able to attend church, but it didn't last. In the spring of 1976, Anneliese's convulsions and seizures and odd behavior came back tenfold, and she began becoming violent with her family members to where they couldn't even be around her without being attacked by her. But when she was left on her own, she would harm herself. She stopped eating, saying that the demons were not allowing her to eat, and all day long she would stand up and then drop to her knees to pray, and then get back up and drop to her knees to pray, breaking both her kneecaps and tearing the tendons in her knees, which seemingly did not faze her. But still, her family believed that what she needed was religious intervention, not medical intervention. Also, Anneliese felt the same way, but some might say that she was not in a position to make that decision, that she had lost her ability to make that decision. But either way, they continued with the exorcisms. The final exorcism of Anneliese took place on June 30th, 1976, and while Anneliese did submit willingly to this exorcism, she was incredibly frail. She weighed under 100 pounds, and by the following morning, on July 1st, 1976, she had passed away due to dehydration and malnutrition. She was only 23 years old. After her death, Anneliese's story was so sensational that it grabbed headlines all over Germany, and people were clamoring to learn more. about how this could happen. That she was, apparently possessed and then died after all these exorcisms. Why wasn't there medical intervention? There was so many questions. And so ultimately what happened is her parents were charged with negligent homicide, but were actually not given a jail sentence because at the time in Germany, they ruled that the parents had already suffered enough, so they did not serve any jail time. And there were two priests, one of them being Renz, who were charged with negligent manslaughter, and they were sentenced to 6 months in jail. That was later suspended. To this day, people are absolutely split down the middle about what actually happened to Anneliese Michel. Was it possession, or was it, like the neurologist said, a form of epilepsy, or was it something else? And furthermore, was psychiatric treatment or was modern medicine doing enough to help her? Or were they failing just as much as the exorcisms ultimately failed? It's a question that to this day people are really unsure how to answer. Her gravesite has become sort of like a monument for many churches around Europe. They will go and basically make the pilgrimage to her gravesite to pay their respects to a girl that they believe in some way died for their sins. So what do you think this was? Was this demonic possession, or was this epilepsy? Or was it something else? And how do you think they should have treated this case? I mean, obviously the medication she was on was not making it any better, but at the same time, the exorcisms didn't seem to do much better either. So how do you treat something like this? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I possibly can. All right, that's gonna do it, guys. If you were interested in this story and like this type of content, if you would please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe to this channel, turn on all post notifications so you can get the 3 to 4 weekly uploads that happen on this channel every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen as well. That's going to do it, guys. Until next time, see ya.